Some of the most important results in math are connected by the same trick. One so simple, it's hard to believe its most natural uses reveal the limits of math itself. This technique shows that some infinities are literally bigger than others and creates weird paradoxes, like a set that contains itself if and only if it doesn't, true statements that can't be proven, and a machine that does the opposite of whatever it does.
Four, maybe more of like the most important results in all of math are all proven sort of using the same technique.
So what is it? To find out, let's go back to 19th century Germany. In 1891, a German mathematician named Georg Cantor answered a seemingly simple question. Are there more counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, etc., or are there more real numbers between 0 and 1, all infinitely long decimals? The answer feels obvious. There are clearly an infinite number of each. But Cantor pushed further. If both sets are really the same size, you should be able to match up their elements 1 to 1. So supposing this is true, he created a table matching up each counting number with a different real number between 0 and 1. And to simplify things, he wrote each real number in binary, as an infinite string of zeros and ones. But now Cantor starts creating a new real number. He takes the first digit of the first number, the second digit of the second number, the third digit of the third number, each digit along the diagonal of the table, all infinitely many of them. Then he flips each digit, from a 0 to a 1 or a 1 to a 0. The new number is also a real number between 0 and 1, but it doesn't appear anywhere on the original list. It's different from the first number at the first digit, the second number at the second digit, and so on. We tried to match up each real number between 0 and 1 with its own unique counting number, but there was still another real number that didn't fit on the list. This means there must in fact be more real numbers between 0 and 1 than there are counting numbers. Even though there are an infinite number of each, Cantor had shown that some infinities are bigger than other infinities. This became known as Cantor's diagonalization proof, because the new real number comes from flipping the digits along the diagonal of the table. But this simple technique, diagonalization, is also directly responsible for several other hugely important results, which expose the very limits of mathematics. When Cantor first came up with diagonalization to show that there are different sizes of infinity, it was a revolutionary idea, and you might think that the mathematical community would have celebrated. But that's not what happened. You see, this was all part of a broader work of Cantor's called set theory. But to many mathematicians, set theory, and especially its implications about infinity, felt like nonsense. To some, it seemed impure, almost heretical that there could be infinities of different sizes. Leopold Kronecker, one of Cantor's harshest critics, even called him a renegade and a corrupter of youth for spreading his ideas. Henri Poincaré and Ludwig Wittgenstein also famously criticized Cantor's work, referring to it as a grave disease, utter nonsense, and a source of pernicious idioms. Cantor had thrown into question the very fundamentals of how mathematics was being done, and people weren't happy about it. The math world fractured, and the fierce attacks were deeply hurtful to Cantor, the lack of appreciation for his work contributing at times to bouts of depression.
Famous mathematicians, top mathematicians at the time, just completely rejected Cantor's work. At least for me, when I first saw it, it did make me uncomfortable. I was like, I've never seen anything like this before, because infinity is a tricky concept. So now, even though I can understand sort of the discomfort, it wasn't okay that people were so mean to him, I would say. We should be more kind to each other.
But Cantor also had his supporters. For example, David Hilbert was a hugely important and well-respected mathematician at the time, and he saw that set theory could help make math more rigorous, providing a way to more precisely define a function and a limit, concepts that mathematicians had always struggled to formalize. So for Hilbert, set theory was a dream come true. He declared, "No one shall expel us from the paradise that Cantor has created."
Many others agreed, but that paradise would be immediately challenged.
You see, a set is just a collection of objects, in many cases, numbers. You could make a set of all counting numbers or all real numbers from 0 to 1, like Cantor did, or a set containing just the numbers 37 and 42, or even a set containing all multiples of pi. But in 1901, a British mathematician named Bertrand Russell discovered that the current rules around the creation of sets led straight to an inevitable paradox that, if left unresolved, would render set theory useless. Imagine Cantor's table again, but this time we'll label the rows and columns with all possible sets, S1, S2, S3, etc. Now, you can't really enumerate all possible sets with counting numbers like this, so this table is more conceptual. Russell may have been thinking about things more abstractly. But he knew that as they were currently defined, sets could contain anything, including other sets. So in our table, we'll fill in each entry with either a check or an X. A check means the set at that row contains the set at that column. So this check means S3 contains S2. This X, on the other hand, means that S1 does not contain S3. Thinking about the properties of such relationships, Russell realized that you can apply diagonalization the exact same way that Cantor did. We can create a new sequence of checks and X's by taking all the infinitely many symbols along the diagonal of this table and then flipping them from an X to a check or a check to an X. Just like Cantor's new real number, this new sequence of checks and X's is different from every row of the table. But think about what this new sequence means. We made the first symbol of the new sequence a check because S1 does not contain S1. We made the second symbol an X because S2 does contain S2. The checks come from exactly the sets that do not contain themselves. So this new sequence seems to represent a set of all sets that don't contain themselves, which we'll call R. But R isn't an actual set. It was explicitly constructed to be different from every set on the table, which contained all sets. If R were a set, it would have been on that list, and would therefore have to be different from itself at the position on the diagonal, which represents whether R contains itself. If R doesn't contain itself, well then R must contain itself, because R is the set of all sets that don't contain themselves. But if R contains itself, then R must not contain itself, because it does. It's a contradiction. This is called Russell's paradox.
What we would now call naive set theory, naive because it leads to Russell's paradox, allowed you to form, the set of all things, of all anything that satisfies any given predicate. What Russell noticed was that, well, if you can do that, then you could make the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. And then that leads to a paradox, because then does that set contain itself?
Over the next few years, mathematicians tried to fix the foundations of set theory.
The most successful effort came from Ernst Zermelo and Abraham Frankel, who created new rules for building sets, excluding things like the set of all sets that don't contain themselves from being a set. These rules eventually evolved into a system known as ZFC, and from that point forward, ZFC became the foundation for modern mathematics.
What I call the Gorm to ZFC thesis, where Gorm stands for good old regular mathematics. So if you're doing like good old regular mathematics and you write a high-level proof in English, we believe that ZFC is rich enough to capture our everyday mathematical reasoning.
In the early 1900s, the development of ZFC was seen as a huge win for the math world. It provided a rigorous, seemingly solid foundation for logical reasoning. But mathematicians would have little time to begin using ZFC in practice before cracks started to show. In 1931, a young logician named Kurt Gödel had set out to find potential limits to the formal systems that mathematicians were quickly adopting. And what he discovered was a fundamental flaw at the root of mathematics. There will always be true statements that cannot be proven. So how did Gödel arrive at this conclusion? Well, he started by thinking about simple propositions. Statements like 2 is an even number are true and should be provable, whereas statements like 3 is an even number are false and should not be provable. But Gödel knew that statements could also have variables, like n is an even number. Let's again use a table to enumerate all possible statements with one variable, like n is even, n is prime, or n is less than 3, and so on. The columns of the table will hold all possible values for n, which we can assume for the sake of simplicity is limited to positive integers, 1, 2, 3, etc. Imagining some fixed mathematical system, the table will be filled with checks and x's based on whether the system is able to prove each statement given different values of n. For example, in the row for n is prime, at the column for n equals 3, there should be a check if the system can prove that 3 is prime. On the other hand, there should be an x at the intersection of n is even and n equals 1, because 1 is not even. Again, Gödel wasn't necessarily thinking about a table exactly like this, but conceptually, what he did next was diagonalization to get a new sequence of checks and x's that is different from every row in the table. Now remember, the rows of the table represent provability of the different statements, which means there is no statement that is provable at exactly the same values of n as the checkmarks in this new sequence. But here's the thing. There is actually a statement that is true at exactly those values of n. Provability and truth turn out to be different here. So what is this statement? If this sequence tells you exactly the values of n that make a certain statement true, what would that statement look like? Well, the checkmarks in the new sequence come from the diagonal entries with an x, the values of n for which statement number n is not provable. So the new statement says this: statement number n is not provable on the input n. Just like Russell's set of all sets that don't contain themselves, this new statement is a sort of meta-statement that refers to other statements in the table. But although quite unusual, it's a perfectly legitimate statement. In a sufficiently powerful mathematical system, you can absolutely represent concepts like provability within the system. So the new statement, just like all the others, must appear in some row of the table. Let's say it's statement 12. Now hold on, the intuitive thing to do here would be to fill in row 12 of the table with the sequence of checks and x's we were just thinking about. But remember, those checks and x's are telling us which values of n make statement 12 true, whereas the table should tell us which values of n make statement 12 provable. And even though those might feel like they should be the same thing, remember that the sequence of trues and falses for statement number 12 was explicitly constructed to be different from every row at the diagonal, including row 12. That diagonal entry corresponds to plugging in n equals 12 in statement 12, which now says statement number 12 is not provable on the input 12. But statement number 12 on the input 12 is this statement. It basically says this statement is not provable. So is the statement true? Well, if it isn't true, it must be provable, which is a problem because now we have a mathematical system that can prove false statements. But if it is true, it must not be provable, because the statement literally says this statement is not provable. So any mathematical system that is powerful enough to represent concepts like provability within that system, such as ZFC, is either unsound, meaning it can prove false statements, or is incomplete, meaning it's not capable of proving some true statements. Gödel then slightly strengthened this result, showing that incompleteness arises as long as the system never leads to statements that contradict each other, a property known as consistency. This is called Gödel's first incompleteness theorem.
Gödel also demonstrated a second incompleteness theorem.
The cherry on the top is, if you have a rich enough formal system, one of the things that it cannot prove is its own consistency.
But there was even more stunning news to come. As it became clear that provability and truth could never align perfectly, another question arose. Could we come up with a solid definition for truth itself?
Just a couple years after Gödel's result, another logician named Alfred Tarski solved this question, and the answer was no. Going back to Gödel's example, the checks and x's in the table meant provable and not provable. But what if we interpret the same checks and x's as true and false? Now, the new statement formed by the diagonalization, which used to say statement number n is not provable on the input n, would instead say statement number n is not true on the input n. If this statement is really a well-defined statement, then, like before, it would be in some row on the original table. And that row, by construction, would have to be different from itself at the position on the diagonal. We'd get a statement that essentially says this statement is not true, which would have to be true if and only if it isn't. The only logical conclusion is that statement number n is not true on the input n is not a well-defined statement, meaning mathematical truth is undefinable.
You can't even define, in any sense, truth. Even though it can be defined in a richer theory, at a higher level theory, it cannot be defined within the theory itself.
This is known as Tarski's Undefinability theorem.
At this point, mathematicians were slowly starting to realize that any formal system is just fundamentally imperfect. All the problems they'd been finding over the years weren't just something that could be fixed. They were an unavoidable phenomenon of our universe that we'd simply have to accept.
A few years later, we would solidify our understanding of this reality, when in 1936, a 24-year-old Alan Turing expanded on Gödel's work regarding incompleteness into a much more general, far-reaching result about the nature of computation. He found that there are some problems that no computer, even in theory, can ever solve. Turing had designed what we now call a Turing machine, a theoretical computing device that's powerful enough to represent anything you could do in a modern programming language. And he was interested in how his machines would behave when you run them on various inputs. Any data you can feed to a computer program is ultimately just a bunch of zeros and ones, which can be viewed as one big binary number. So to keep things simple, we'll think of the input to a Turing machine as a single positive integer, n. Running a Turing machine always results in one of two outcomes. Either the machine eventually halts and finishes the computation, or it never halts, it keeps running forever. Again, visualizing things in a table, this time we'll label the rows by all possible Turing machines, M1, M2, M3, etc. And the columns will be all possible inputs to the machines, all possible values of n. Inside the table, an H means the machine at that row eventually halts using the value for n in that column. An infinity symbol means the machine at that row never halts using the value for n in that column. It runs forever. Now, just like in all the previous examples, we can diagonalize to get a new sequence of h's and infinities that is different from every row of the table. And remember, the rows of the table represent whether or not a machine halts on the different values of n. The h's come from the diagonal entries with an infinity symbol, the values of n for which the nth machine doesn't halt. So there is no machine that halts on precisely the values of n for which the nth machine doesn't halt. If there was, that machine would have to behave the opposite of itself, at the entry on the diagonal. It would have to halt if and only if it doesn't. A contradiction. The famous corollary of this result is that there is also no machine that can determine in general whether another machine will halt or run forever, a task known as the halting problem. So why can't there be a Turing machine that solves the halting problem? Well, if there was a machine that could always correctly determine whether another machine will halt or not, we could use that machine to solve the previous task of halting on exactly the values of n that the nth machine doesn't halt, since we'd always be able to determine whether or not the nth machine halts on the input n. But we know from a moment ago that this task is impossible. There can't be a machine that solves it. And since that impossible problem reduces to the halting problem, it means the halting problem must also be impossible. It's what we call an undecidable problem. In addition to the halting problem, we now know many other undecidable problems, questions that not even the most powerful supercomputers can answer. And it just can't be any other way. Now, interestingly, Turing never formulated the halting problem himself. This is actually a slight and common reinterpretation of his work, which shows that a very similar but different problem is undecidable. But the important thing to learn about undecidability isn't really about any specific undecidable problem.
He doesn't directly talk about halting, but he definitely was doing diagonalization. If you want to get to, in some sense, the shortest proof that is easiest to verify, consider the halting problem. Now let me show you that it's undecidable by doing this and that. And you're left wondering well, how did you think about this halting problem in the first place? Where did it come from? It should be illegal to do this in this way because you've hidden one of the most important features of diagonalization, which is that it gives you an explicit construction of the undecidable problem.
The key takeaway from Turing is, in his words, the diagonal process. The exact same technique that Cantor had used decades prior to show that infinity comes in different sizes. And it's not just a modification to Cantor's proof. In a sense, it's the exact same proof, just with machines and behaviors of those machines instead of counting numbers and digits of a real number. While Cantor showed that there are more real numbers between 0 and 1 than there are counting numbers, Turing showed that there are more possible machine behaviors than there are machines. Essentially, there are more problems than there are algorithms to solve them. Fundamentally, this is all diagonalization is. It's just a trick that constructs a new item from a list, one that's different from every existing item at the spot along the diagonal. But that simple idea, when applied in the right situations, ultimately leads to self-referential paradoxes, like a set that contains itself if and only if it doesn't, a statement that can be proven if and only if it's not true, or a machine that halts if and only if it doesn't.
Russell's paradox, Gödel's theorem, undecidability, I can think of any of them as diagonalizations.
Some of the most important results in math really just come from the same trick, a simple technique that exposes the limits of math itself. Diagonalization transformed our concept of infinity and leads to inescapable paradoxes. It implies that some truths cannot be proven, that truth itself is undefinable, and that some problems are impossible to solve. So is all our hard work and creativity ultimately futile? Well, not exactly.
Incompleteness, undefinability, undecidability. It doesn't seem to matter that much for doing regular mathematics.
Yeah, most statements, mathematical statements that we care about, either the statement or its negation is going to be provable.
Eugene Wigner, had this famous article about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in physics. But one could even just ask about the unreasonable effectiveness of math for math. right? Among all the questions that we could ask, why do so many of them, actually have proofs or disproofs. When Gödel first proved his incompleteness theorem, I think the reigning assumption at the time was like, sure, you can do this, but you can only do this because you are constructing an utterly bizarre statement that ultimately talks about itself. Most sentences are not talking about themselves. Fermat's last theorem, right? It's about integers. It's not about itself. It's not about universal computers. I think we still don't have an arithmetical question whose answer we would have otherwise cared about that's not itself about formal systems, which is known to be independent of the axioms of set theory. There's lots and lots of unsolved problems, the Riemann hypothesis, the twin prime conjecture. Maybe the vast majority of these things are, really are undecidable. And we just, like to trumpet, our successes. I think that there must be more to it than that. It could be that we are guided by our own past successes, to ask the kinds of questions that could be amenable to a similar success. And only more rarely do we ask a question that sort of goes, way out into the deep part of the ocean.
Many people don't do mathematics at that deep end. But at the same time, yes, there are some important problems that we care about that are undecidable. And knowing that they're undecidable is good and allows us to deal with those undecidability results in other ways. And in some sense, you could argue this version of reality is more interesting.
In theory, we have no right to know the answers to so many of the richest questions we've asked. But we are now more than ever discovering some of the most impressive and beautiful results in mathematics. And the fact that our capabilities are ultimately limited makes what we can do all the more special. Thanks for watching. I want to take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, CyberGhost VPN.
When you browse the internet, there are plenty of eyes watching. Your internet service provider, your school or work's IT department, and even your home Wi-Fi router can all track what you do online, even if you use incognito mode. But CyberGhost VPN protects your digital privacy. Simply select one of their 100+ locations before you browse the web to encrypt and reroute all of your traffic through their secure servers. And once you do, no one will be able to track your online activity. CyberGhost also unlocks geo-restricted games and content from over 40 streaming platforms, like Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney+. And you can even score better deals online by simply changing your virtual location. With over 38 million users worldwide and over 20,000 excellent reviews on Trustpilot, it's one of the best VPNs out there. It also works on all major devices and operating systems, Windows, Mac, Android, iOS, and you can protect up to 7 devices at the same time, perfect for sharing with friends and family. By using the link in the description, you'll get an 84% discount and 4 months for free, with a 45-day money-back guarantee and access to 24/7 customer support, making everything risk-free for you. Huge thanks to CyberGhost VPN for sponsoring this video. And as always, thanks to you for watching.